I've got must start and sit running backs for week 12 of the fantasy football season. We'll go through all 32 teams, 16 matchups in total. At the end of this video, we will have talked about more than 60 wide receivers. So consider this your complete guide to the running back position for week 12 of the fantasy football season. Keep in mind, no teams on bye. We have the Thanksgiving games this week. It's going to be a good week of football. Quickly pause right now if you want to see the terminology that I'm going to be using throughout this video. Okay, we will start with the Thanksgiving Day games. We've got 3 games on Thanksgiving. Hey, make sure you're hanging out with your family, with your friends, but more importantly, make sure you're doing it around these football games. The first game on Thursday, Thanksgiving Day games, we've got the Packers at the Detroit Lions. 46.5 point over under, and the Lions are favored at home on Turkey Day. Let's talk about the Packers side of the ball first. Aaron Jones is probably not going to play in this game. In fact, I think he's likely going to be ruled out here very, very soon, which means a lot of people will be considering and asking the question, do we start A.J. Dillon? Well, I have labeled him as a spot start. However, A.J. Dillon, let's keep in mind, guys, he is very rarely capitalized as a starting running back for fantasy football purposes. In fact, in the last 2 years, AJ has averaged less fantasy points without Aaron Jones than with him. So if you're considering him one of those guys that you're definitely going to start this week, I would just say pull back the reins a little bit. He's a spot start. If you're in a tough position because of injuries, you can put him in your starting lineup, but don't expect much. Expect volume. Don't expect efficiency. Last week, without Aaron Jones, he averaged about 2 yards per carry, and this is not a good matchup versus the Lions defense. They give up the 5th fewest points to fantasy running backs, so you can play him based off volume, but don't expect very much. As for the Lions side of the ball, we've been saying this since David Montgomery came back. Both of these guys are locked and loaded must-start running backs. Since Montgomery has come back after the bye week, Jahmyr Gibbs is averaging over 23 fantasy points per game, and David Montgomery is averaging a healthy 17.5 fantasy points per game in a PPR format. Both of those guys should be considered absolute must-starts in a game where they face the Packers, who give up the 11th most points to fantasy quarterbacks. All right, moving on to the second game, Thursday, Turkey Day. We've got the Commanders at the Cowboys. This will be probably a pretty bad game for the Commanders, if I'm honest with you. But 48.5 point over under, and the Cowboys are favored at home. Tony Pollard is definitely someone that you can be going ahead and putting into your lineups. Obviously, if you're in an 8 or a 10-man league, you might have a better option. But in any 12-man format, I doubt you have a better option on your roster. So I'm going to label him a must start. The Commanders are middle of the pack when it comes to giving up points to their running backs. However, keep in mind, no Chase Young, no Montez Sweat. They would have helped the run game earlier in the year. And as for the Commanders side of the ball, I don't see a clear must start. Now, if Antonio Gibson is out once again, we saw he was limited in practice on Monday. So that is leaning towards him playing in this game. If Antonio Gibson does not play, you can consider starting Brian Robinson. But even then, I mean, this matchup is not good. The Cowboys are 26th in points allowed to running backs. The only way Brian Robinson is going to be good for fantasy is based off of volume. And if this team is down and Antonio Gibson is healthy and playing, we've seen that they are happy to use him as a receiving back for them, in that kind of like, let's get the ball down the field. Let's just do what we have to do when they're down in games. So I don't really feel good about a Commanders running back this week, if I'm honest with you. And the last game of the Thanksgiving Day slate, we've got 49ers at Seahawks, 42.5 point over under. As for Christian McCaffrey, of course, that guy is in your lineup. Y'all know that by now. But Zach Charbonnet is slated to get his first start at the running back position for the Seattle Seahawks. And last week, when Kim Walker went down early in that game, he played 85% of the snaps and he touched the ball 21 times. Between Zach Charbonnet and A.J. Dillon, for example, I would rather play Charbonnet. I mean, neither of these matchups are very good for those two running backs. However, the difference is Charbonnet has always been very involved as a pass catcher. Last week, his first week without Charbonnet, 6 targets, his highest in his career. Neither have a good matchup, but Charbonnet, I think, is a more talented player. So if you have to choose between those two names, I feel better about Charbonnet as a spot start on the Thanksgiving Day slate, excuse me. Okay, we are moving on to the first ever Black Friday game. What do you guys think about the Black Friday game? It's Dolphins at Jets. Do you have any opinion on this game? I'm curious if people like the idea of a Black Friday game, but 40.5 point over under, and the Jets are favored away from home. As for the Dolphins side of the ball, this is actually a pretty good matchup. The Jets are top 10 in fantasy points allowed to the running back position. Raheem Mostert absolutely can be put into your lineups. He got a ton of volume last week, 24 total touches. And at the moment, I don't believe Devon Achane is going to play in this game. However, if he is available, I personally do feel comfortable playing him. It's a good matchup. He got out there early and often. Well, at least early. He only got one carry and then one target. He got out there early. He showed some value, but of course the injury held him back. But again, if he's healthy in a 12-man league with the amount of injuries we have right now, I think you can go ahead and put him in your lineup. In 8 or 10-mans, you might look another direction. As for the Jets side of the ball, Breece Hall is always a must start. Now, Breece Hall is not getting much done on the ground. When you lose Mekhi Becton, when the entire defense, their game plan is, hey, go ahead and throw the ball, but we're not going to let you run it. It's just not very good for your running efficiency. However, Breece Hall is an absolute weapon through the air. Last week, he scored a touchdown through the air, and he hasn't scored under 10 PPR points since getting the full workload in week 5 onwards. So definitely he is a must start in my eyes. Okay, that brings us on to the 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate. The first game we're going to look at on Sunday is the Saints at the Falcons, 42.5 point over under. This interdivisional rivalry, both of these teams have a chance to make the playoffs. And when I look at this from a running back perspective, it's actually quite simple. You start Alvin Kamara. He's been absolutely lethal in fantasy since coming back from that suspension. You continue to start him. And as for Bijan Robinson, finally last time out, Arthur Smith and this team gave him what we've been asking, which is volume. 22 rushing attempts. He got a rushing touchdown. Finally, you're starting to use your first round pick the way we envision you using him all along. Now, it's not a good matchup for either of these running backs, but both of these running backs are talented enough and their usage is in a place where they can overcome a bad matchup. So I would consider both of them must starts. As for Tyler Algier, unfortunately, the cause and effect of Bijan becoming a workhorse player is that Tyler's probably not going to get the volume that you need to start him in any sort of format. On to the 6th matchup of the week. Steelers at the Bengals, a 34.5 point over under. That is the lowest over under I had seen until this week, personally. Now, there's another game that has an even lower over under. Point being is Vegas is not expecting this to be a very high scoring game. Fantasy points may come at a premium in this matchup. No Joe Burrow, and unfortunately still Kenny Pickett playing for the Steelers. Let's talk about those Steeler running backs, though. I know a lot of people are going to be coming into this week very excited about starting Jaylen Warren. I'm not going to label him a must start. I think you can start him if you're in a tough position, but he got a lot of yards last week. He just didn't dominate the backfield from a touches perspective. In fact, he had less snaps than Najee Harris, and he had less rushing attempts than Najee Harris. So despite them naming him the starter, there's still a chance if the matchup doesn't go his way and he doesn't have a big breakout run that he could be a disappointment for fantasy purposes. But again, he's going to give you a solid 4. He's always good for about 10 to 12 points in PPR. Just don't expect, that league winning status like we saw this last week. And as for Najee Harris, he remains still a spot start. Not a guy that you're excited to start by any means. As for the other side of the ball, Joe Mixon was finally starting to really become a legit fantasy threat. And then Joe Burrow goes down due to injury. So there will be a couple things that I imagine change here. Firstly, I think you're going to get a ton of volume now. I think Joe Mixon is going to see 20 opportunities in this game. That's just how I personally see this kind of playing out. However, you're going to be a less efficient offense, which means there will be less scoring opportunities for a guy like Joe Mixon. Hopefully, it kind of pans itself out. It is a good matchup. The Steelers are top 12 in fantasy points allowed to the position. So I believe that you can start Joe Mixon, and hopefully the offense is kind of centered around him. All right, the seventh matchup we're going to look at today is the Jags at the Texans. A lot of good divisional matchups to look at this week. As for Travis Etienne, you can absolutely start him. The Texans are middle of the pack when you look at points allowed to the fantasy running back position. However, the last time, Etienne played this team, he was very efficient, almost 150 yards, almost 5 yards per carry on the ground. So Etienne is a fine play, again, versus the Houston Texans this week. I know it's been a couple bad performances, but you got to keep putting that guy into your lineup. And as for the Texans side of the ball, this is where things get pretty messy. If Devin Singletary is the only option in that backfield, then I think you can consider playing him. However, if Dameon Pierce is back and healthy, which at the moment it looks like he will play this week, I don't think there's a clear start in this backfield. And you might be saying, Zach, what are you talking about? Devin Singletary has been so good. Well, this team has already come out and said that when Dameon Pierce is healthy, it's going to be a running back rotation. It's going to be a committee. And that's just not something that I feel like any of us want to rely on for fantasy football purposes. So just not a running back that I'm very excited about this week. And keep in mind, Devin Singletary was one of those guys I was super excited about last week because of the matchup and because of the volume. All right, the eighth matchup we're going to look at here is the Bucs at the Colts. It's a 43.5 point over under, and the Colts are favored at home. How about that? Jonathan Taylor, must-start player. Similar to Bijan Robinson, similar to Alvin Kamara. These are elite talents at the running back position, and it might not be a good matchup, but they can always overcome it with volume and with efficiency. Now, as for Rachaad White, I'm also going to label him a must-start. We have a combination of a good matchup and volume. Rachaad White going up against the Colts. They are 10th in points allowed to running backs, and he has been absolutely dominating touches in this backfield. Last week, he played 80% of the snaps and saw 16 touches. The week before, 23 touches. The week before that, 24 touches. Rachaad White is the RB6 on the year. As crazy as that sounds in PPR, the RB6. He's definitely a must start. Kind of game script proof, because if the Bucs are down, they're going to throw it to him. And if they're up, they're going to throw it to him and they're going to use him on the ground. So Rachaad White, definitely someone that should be in most of your lineups. All right, the ninth matchup we're going to look at here is the Patriots at the Giants, 33.5 point over under. Remember earlier when I talked about how we're seeing some season low over under numbers. This game is the lowest over under I have seen of any game so far from Vegas this year. 33.5 points. That is not many points that Vegas is expecting going around. The Patriots are actually favored in this game, and they're away. They're at New York. However, there are two clear must-starts, in my opinion, in this matchup. The first one being Ramondre Stevenson. He's getting a lot of opportunities with this team, and now he gets to face the Giants, who give up the sixth most points to fantasy running backs. And then Saquon Barkley, again, another player that kind of proved us wrong this week. Hey, I'm talented. I'm extremely viable for fantasy purposes. I'm going to see the volume. And they were using him not as a dump-off receiver, but someone that they were targeting down the field. So this is a very valuable running back who, in good matchups, is going to give you a high amount of fantasy points, coming off the RB1 finish this week versus the Washington Commanders. So you can definitely start Saquon Barkley. Super talented player. You can start Saquon, let's be honest. Okay, the 10th matchup we're going to look at here is the Panthers at the Titans, a 37 point over under, and the Titans are favored at home. This just does not feel like an exciting game to watch. And I just don't see Derrick Henry. You can start for sure in this matchup. You can start him. The Panthers are giving up the second most fantasy points to running backs. But outside of him, who the heck do you start? Chuba Hubbard had a chance to take over this job completely. He's not been performing. and he didn't take over the job. Miles Sanders and Chuba pretty much split work down the middle last week. It's not a very good matchup. I don't expect them to be up in this game. You just have to hope in this matchup that Derrick Henry kind of has one of his vintage Derrick Henry games where he goes off and gets 22 plus carries and dominates a pretty weak run defense. So Derrick Henry is the only clear start here. I'd say 90% of people have a better start than that Panthers backfield. The 11th matchup of the week we're going to look at here is the Rams at the Cardinals, 44.5 point over under. And how about this? The Cardinals are favored at home. That might be the first time we have said those words on this video series. By the way, this is the start of the afternoon game slate. Let's talk about the Rams. Kyren Williams is coming back from injury, from that ankle injury, and you can absolutely put him right back into your lineups with confidence. They held him out longer than he needed to be held out. He's had the bye week. He's been out at least 4 games, now 5 weeks in total, and he gets to play the Arizona Cardinals, the same Arizona Cardinals that just allowed Devin Singletary to dominate them for fantasy purposes, giving up the 3rd most fantasy points per game. Kyren Williams should be locked and loaded into people's lineups, again, coming off injury. And as for James Conner, I'm going to label him a spot start. I think you can start him. He's still getting volume. In the last 2 weeks since coming back from injury, he's played over 60% of the snaps, and he's seen at least 16 touches in both of those games. So I do think he's still an option. He just hasn't found the end zone. It's been more Kyler Murray running the show, but I still think he's an option depending on how desperate you are. The 12th matchup we're going to look at here is the Browns at the Broncos, 36.5 point over under here. Let's talk about the Browns. I think Jerome Ford is one of my favorite starts this week. Nobody gives up more fantasy points to running backs than the Denver Broncos. Now, the Broncos defense as a whole has gotten much, much better, but that's mainly through the air. You cannot throw on the secondary. They're a very solid squad, but on the ground, you can run all over this defense. I mean, last week, the Broncos run defense made Alexander Mattison and Ty Chandler look like absolute superstars. When you think about a guy like Jerome Ford, in the last 3 weeks, he's been dominating this backfield, and now he gets to face the Denver Broncos defense. 100% he is in play. Expect a good week from Jerome Ford. And Kareem Hunt is one of the more favorable spot start candidates this week because of his involvement, because of the work he's gotten in the red zone specifically for this team. Before last week, he had scored a touchdown in 5 straight games. I think he has a chance to get back into the end zone this week versus the Denver Broncos. And as for Javonte Williams, I'm still going to label him a must start. But I will say the usage of this Denver running back backfield is getting confusing. It is getting very, very confusing. It looked like they wanted to use Javonte Williams as a workhorse, back-to-back weeks with over 25 touches. And then last week, they kind of get Samaje Perine and Jaleel McLaughlin just as involved as Javonte Williams. So it's a little bit confusing, but I still think if you're going to play one of these guys, Javonte Williams is the play. All right, moving on to the 13th matchup of the week. Chiefs at the Raiders, 44.5 point over under. The Chiefs are going to be looking to get back on track after losing a frustrating game on Monday Night Football. MVS barely dropping the ball, the game winner. They want to get back on track. But what did work in that game was Isaiah Pacheco. He carried the ball 19 times, almost 5 yards per carry against one of the NFL's best rushing defenses. So Pacheco is absolutely in play here. He gets a much easier matchup versus the Las Vegas Raiders, who give up the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs. And Josh Jacobs as well is another guy that, similar to Saquon Barkley, he's not on the best offense, but he's a very talented player. He's going to get a ton of volume. We just heard an interview this week where his head coach said, we want Josh Jacobs touching the ball at least 22 times every single game. So with that kind of volume and the talent of a Josh Jacobs, that's a guy that just needs to be in your lineup at all moments. On to the 14th matchup of the week. We've got the Bills at the Eagles. 47.5 point over under, one of the highest of this week, and the Eagles are favored at home. I think James Cook, he's a fine start. I think he's going to get plenty of opportunities. Last week, he had 21 total touches. That was great to see if you love James Cook, but it's not a very good defense. I know we just saw a very good matchup. I know we just saw Isaiah Pacheco run all over these guys, but that seems to be an outlier to me, not a rule. Still, though, I would say James Cook is a safe top 26 play at the position, purely because of the offense that he's on and the volume that he will see. As for DeAndre Swift, you guys know this. You can start DeAndre Swift. The Bills' run defense is not scary this year. And behind that offensive line, DeAndre Swift is always a threat to be the RB1 on any given week. Okay, we have made it to Sunday Night Football. And we've got a pretty exciting matchup for Sunday Night Football. At least I personally think it will be an exciting one. Ravens at the Chargers, 46.5 point over under. The good news for the Chargers is this is not at Baltimore, because we have seen plenty of good teams, the Lions, for example, get dominated offensively at Baltimore. So it's good for them that it's not actually away for this matchup. But let's talk about the running backs here. Gus Edwards, definitely a player that you can start. Every time they are in the red zone, Gus Edwards is a threat to score a touchdown. So he is someone that you can definitely be putting into your lineups. Keaton Mitchell, he just hasn't built the confidence, the trust to be a starting running back for fantasy just yet. And because Keaton Mitchell is getting more and more opportunities, Justice Hill has become completely irrelevant. As far as Austin Eckler goes, he's coming off a pretty bad game, but I just believe they're going to really need him as a pass catcher in this game. He's not going to have an efficient game on the ground. He's not going to look fast. He's not going to have, any sort of breakaway runs, but he's going to be an important and integral part, rather, to their passing game with their struggles now that Josh Palmer and Mike Williams are gone for the year. So he remains a must start for me. And moving on to Monday Night Football, let's take a breath. A lot of talking so far. Hopefully you're enjoying the video. But we've got the Bears at the Vikings, 45.5 point over under. As for the Bears, it is very, very messy. Deontay Foreman left last week's game with that ankle injury after scoring the touchdown. And then Khalil Herbert pretty much dominated the rushing opportunities. But this just is not a team that you want to run against. The Vikings, you want to throw on them. You don't want to run on them. They are 24th in points allowed to running backs. So I don't personally feel good about starting any of those names. I think 70% of people probably have a better option on their roster. As for the other side of the ball, Alexander Mattison is absolutely someone that you can put into your lineups. Last week, he carried the ball 18 times. He had 20 touches, and now he gets to face the Bears, who are 8th in points allowed to the running back position. I also think Ty Chandler is a spot start. I think he has another opportunity here to face a bad run defense and kind of capitalize on it. I know the Bears are technically not a bad run defense, but they've just been getting dominated for fantasy purposes. So I think Ty Chandler, he's got the juice. He looks like the most explosive guy in this backfield. He's building trust with the coaching staff. I think if you're in a desperate spot, there are worse starts out there than a guy like Ty Chandler. So those are all the matchups for this week. I appreciate you guys watching the video. Do me a favor, hit that like button, and good luck here in the Thanksgiving Day games and in week 12. Go get a win, and we'll see you very soon. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy, even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.